You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
So this summer marks the 17th anniversary of us purchasing our home, and ever since we moved in, my wife Mary Jane has been bugging me to go to the drive-in theater that's down the road. I'm guessing it's about 10 minutes away. And the main reason we've never gone is that I remember how uncomfortable it was to sit in a car while watching a movie. It's just something I have little desire to do. Now, when I was a kid, we used to go to the Rock Hill Drive-In Theater in Rock Hill, New York. It was just a short drive from my grandparents' summer place. And it closed in 1977, but prior to that, my family would go there several times each summer. But only one movie I ever saw there stands out in my mind. My Uncle Mel, that's my dad's youngest brother, he took all of us kids to see a horror movie one night. And I'm guessing this is probably the early 1970s, say 72, 73, 74, somewhere in there. And I remember absolutely nothing about this movie other than it was giant rats killing people. The photography was awful, basically close-ups of rats, making them look supersized, coupled with, of course, the awful story. As for the name of the movie, I have absolutely no clue. If I had to pick one, it would be Attack of the Killer Rats, but I checked Internet Movie Database, and there's no such title. Not that the title really matters. It's just one of a countless number of movies that have been made where animals go on the attack and, of course, kill people. Well, today I have a story for you that if Hollywood had made it into a movie, would have involved tons of monkeys escaping from a zoo and then going on a rampage as they move through some fictional town somewhere. There would have been lots of blood, gore, and death. Now, if that's something you'd like to hear about, I have really bad news for you. None of that happens in the story I'm about to tell you. Instead, it's a story from August of 1935 where somewhere between 150 and 175 rhesus monkeys escaped from a zoo on New York's Long Island. And I can tell you, no humans were harmed. But it was a story that captured headlines nationwide, that is before fading away and becoming a footnote to history. So today I present to you the long-forgotten true story of Escape from Monkey Mountain. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
I think I'll begin this story with a simple question. Have you ever heard of a man named Frank Buck? My hunch is that you haven't. In fact, I had never heard of him prior to researching this story either. You see, aside from a small zoo in Gainesville, Texas that bears his name, Frank Buck is mostly forgotten today. But in the years prior to his death at age 66 in 1950, bring him back alive, Buck was probably the most famous collector of wild animals in the entire world. He was a best-selling author, a movie star with Clark Gable good looks, and a renowned jungle explorer. His obituary in the March 26, 1950 edition of the New York Times stated, quote, "He once estimated that in nearly 33 years he had captured more than 100,000 birds of every variety, more than 50 elephants, scores of pythons, 65 tigers, and also hundreds of other wild animals, all tracked down in the far corners of the earth." Unquote. It's important to note that Buck was a masterful storyteller, so I'm almost certain that he fudged those numbers upward from their true values. And add to that the fact that critics have suggested that Buck acted more as an animal broker, than someone who personally went out and captured these creatures himself. But even if that's true, there's absolutely no denying that he was the leading source of wild animals for zoos and circuses all throughout the United States during the first half of the 20th century. If you were in need of a lion, a tiger, a monkey, or whatever, you would contact Frank Buck. So famous was Frank Buck during his lifetime that he was asked to set up an exhibition at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. Officially, it was called Frank Buck's Jungle Camp, and it was supposed to be a recreation of a camp that Frank and his assistants used to collect animals while in Asia. While it's doubtful that this exhibit looked anything like the real camp, there's no question that it was stocked with animals collected from all over the world, and the exhibit proved to be a phenomenal success. It's estimated that more than 2 million people visited the jungle camp, but as the close of the fair approached in 1934, Frank Buck faced a unique problem. That is, what do you do with all these wild animals? You can't simply box them up and put them in a warehouse or, throw them in the garbage or whatever. These are live animals. Well, in March of 1935, which is several months after the close of the fair, the solution was announced. A permanent jungle camp would be built in Massapequa, New York, which is out on Long Island. As the crow flies, that's about 30 miles or 48 kilometers east of Manhattan. The new zoo would be located on a 20-acre parcel that sat just south of both Sunrise Highway and the Long Island Railroad. Construction was to begin immediately, and the park opened just in time for the 1935 summer season. One of the most popular exhibits at the new zoo was its Monkey Mountain. In fact, it was the most popular part of the World's Fair exhibit, and it was a tall artificial rock formation that just jutted high up into the sky. It was stocked with hundreds of rhesus monkeys, and then there was a water-filled moat that kept the animals confined to the island. And for further security, there was an 8-foot or 2.44-meter tall wall that encircled the entire exhibit. While the monkeys could easily enter and exit the water from the mountainside, they could just walk right into the water and walk out, there was absolutely no way for them to jump from the water and up over that tall wall. That's what really kept them confined. Estimates of the number of monkeys housed in the exhibit varied widely. Some claim there were as many as 570, though Frank Buck's partner and park manager T.A. Loveland gave a more conservative account. Now, according to him, 200 monkeys had stayed through the winter of 1934 into 1935, and I'm guessing those are the ones from the World's Fair. Then another 200 arrived in July of 1935, which of course brings a total of 400, but of course there's offspring to add to that. Then an additional 200 were expected to arrive in September. It's worth noting that this wasn't meant to be a permanent home for such a large number of monkeys. Many of the zoo's animals were eventually relocated to other facilities across the country. Yes, some would stay in the zoo, but many of them would eventually be shipped off elsewhere. Of course, confining such a large number of monkeys into such a small area is messy business, and someone has to clean it up. One of the men assigned to that task was park employee Charles Sellner. At a little after 11 a.m. on Wednesday, August 21st of 1935, that's just a few months after the park opened, Sellner laid a sturdy plank between the protective wall and the shoreline of Monkey Mountain. Then, armed with a bucket and cleaning supplies, he carefully climbed up onto the makeshift bridge and he crossed over the nearly stagnant water below. And once on the other side, he began the painstaking job of scrubbing the many nooks and crannies of that man-made mountain. What Sellner didn't realize was that he had just made a critical mistake. He was so focused on the work that he was doing that he forgot to remove the plank that connected Monkey Mountain to the outer wall, effectively giving the monkeys a direct path to freedom. And they didn't hesitate. Like a non-stop parade, monkey after monkey scrambled across the plank and they bolted from the enclosure. It would be several minutes before Sellner realized what had happened, but by then it was too late. At first he was stunned and didn't quite know what to do, but as he came to his senses he yanked the plank away to stop any more escapes. But it was estimated that as many as 173 monkeys had already made their getaway. Naturally, every great escape needs a ringleader, and in this case it was a monkey named Al Capone. He earned the nickname thanks to his habit of always snatching the best food during feeding time. In other words, he was quite aggressive. It was a park visitor, Mrs. Arthur Soper of Brentwood, New York, who first noticed that the monkeys were on the loose. So she alerted a young woman who was collecting admissions, who immediately dropped what she was doing and raised the alarm. Panic ensued. The crowds, they ran screaming for their lives as the monkeys attacked. They were biting, they were clawing, they were ripping the clothes off the people. Okay, none of that ever happened. The reality was that within minutes the entire zoo staff was combing the woods behind Monkey Mountain, and they did manage to catch 2 of the stragglers, but nearly all the other ones had already gotten away. Nassau County Police were quickly notified and they joined in the search effort. By the end of the day, officers had managed to capture just 2 of the escaped monkeys. One was caught when a policeman tossed a piece of canvas over it, while the other was lassoed after being spotted perched on a fence several miles away. Meanwhile, officials at the jungle camp weren't overly concerned. That's because they considered the monkeys to be mostly harmless, and they were certain that once things calmed down a bit, the animals would settle in the nearby woods and form a colony. And of course, at that point, they planned to set traps and recapture them. Charles Sellner, the man who inadvertently allowed the monkeys to escape, jokingly told a reporter,
"Monkeys are like lions. I mean lions like elks and Rotarians, the kind that hold conventions. They'll all meet somewhere soon and decide to come back, or else we'll capture them."
The following day, the Brooklyn Times-Union reported that, as a result of his mistake, Sellner had, quote, joined the ranks of the unemployed, unquote. Shortly after their escape, around 50 monkeys sought shelter on the tracks of the Long Island Railroad. Remember, the tracks are right outside the park. Now, since it was an electrified line, there was some concern that they might be electrocuted by that notorious third rail, but fortunately very few were harmed. But before long, a train did approach, and the monkey showed no intention of moving, and that forced the engineer to bring the train to a complete stop. The crew did manage to clear the tracks, and after a brief 5-minute delay, the train continued on its way to nearby Seaford. But just to be safe, the railroad later dispatched a crew that was specifically tasked with keeping those monkeys off the tracks. So you're probably wondering, where is Frank Buck, the park's namesake during all this chaos? Well, he was aboard a ship that was returning from Singapore accompanied by a fresh haul of jungle animals. The press reported that he had approximately 2,000 live animals, the bulk of which were destined for the zoo. Meanwhile, back at Jungle Camp, Director Loveland announced that anyone who returned a monkey alive would receive a season pass to the zoo. That offer was later increased to a $10 reward, which was roughly $235 today. And for those eager to try their luck, Loveland offered some advice. That is that the best way to catch a monkey was to toss a coat or blanket over it, and then what you would do is lift it by the shoulders. If you fail to do so, that could result in the monkey biting you or scratching you. So keep that in mind the next time you need to catch a monkey. As police continued the search for the escapees, they also issued a warning to roadside fruit stand operators. That was that they should keep a close eye on their produce, especially those oranges and bananas. And if anything went missing overnight, there was a very high chance that the monkeys were the culprits. The zoo did remain open throughout the night in case any of the monkeys were found, or should any of them decide to return on their own. And believe it or not, that's exactly what some of them did. During the night, around 30 of the escapees scaled the wall surrounding Monkey Island, leapt over the moat, and they returned to their enclosure. But because of the darkness, park officials couldn't determine the exact number that had come back. Guess they were hungry. The day after the great monkey escape, crowds of curious visitors flooded the road leading to the zoo, requiring 4 police officers to step in and manage the heavy traffic. And if nothing else, this is great PR for the jungle camp, and hundreds of people paid the 25-cent admission, which is nearly $6 in today's money, to enter the park. By the end of the second day, park officials revised their count. They now believe that there were 111 monkeys still on the lam. The press reported that 2 had been brought back by 2 14-year-old boys living in North Babylon. They were Richard Carpenter and John Kizmetsky, and they were able to catch the monkeys by throwing their coats over them. Then another 6 were brought in by Iceman John Sacchio of Amityville. He said he spotted them in a tree, so he grabbed a basket of apples and placed that basket inside his truck. Of course, the monkeys were hungry, so they jumped into the truck. He then slammed the truck's door behind them, and he drove them back to the zoo. There was also a group of about 20 monkeys spotted high up on a flagpole just outside the entrance to the jungle camp. Of course, park employees tried to coax them down with fresh bananas, but that didn't work. So what they next did was called in the fire department, and they arrived with their hook and ladder truck, but it wasn't quite tall enough to reach the top of the pole. But they were undeterred. 3 firefighters climbed the ladder and used long bamboo poles to gently prod at the monkeys. Instinctively, the monkeys grabbed hold of the halyards, the ropes, and that allowed workers to lower them safely to the ground. Tragically, 4 of the monkeys were found deceased. 2 were electrocuted after completing the circuit between the railroad's third rail and the ground, while the other 2 were discovered at the base of a power line near Hicksville. Officials from the Long Island Lighting Company attributed a half-hour power outage in Amityville to the monkeys, noting that this was the first time in the company's history that monkeys had caused such an incident. And I'll just throw in here that I think it's safe to assume that it's also the last time this ever occurred. In the early hours of Friday, August 23rd, Sidney Milo was driving down Seaford Avenue, which is around 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers west of the zoo. Suddenly, a large group of monkeys, he thought around 35 of them, appeared right in front of his car. So he swerved to avoid hitting them, and he crashed into a tree. And while Sidney was unharmed, unfortunately, he killed one of the monkeys. He then contacted the zoo, and they dispatched a team to the scene. And while most of the monkeys escaped into the underbrush, 7 of them were captured. At around 1 p.m. the next day, Al Capone, the group's fearless leader, was finally apprehended. Photos of Capone, complete with a sign displaying his inmate number, were taken, and his mugshot was distributed to the press. However, just like all great criminal masterminds, he managed to escape half an hour later. That Sunday, the park reported that all but 21 of the escaped monkeys had been accounted for. Meanwhile, L.V. Longbotham of New Haven, Connecticut, claimed to have spotted a group of them in the woods. But rather than alerting the zoo, he decided to capture them himself. Armed with a bunch of bananas, what else, he managed to lure the monkeys out, but he never caught any of them. They simply snatched the bananas and bolted. But the monkeys didn't just stop with the fruit. According to Longbotham, one, possibly Al Capone himself, made off with his hat. So he later drove to the zoo to report the incident, and in return they gave him a brand new hat. Then Monday evening, 40 bunches of bananas were hung on the wire fence surrounding the perimeter of the zoo. And with 4,000 feet of fencing, that meant placing a bunch of bananas every 100 feet or 30.48 meters. The next day, the New York Daily News published a humorous letter to the editor. Penned by William Telsley of Brooklyn, it read,
"About those monkeys who escaped from the zoo on Long Island. I think we had better get it on record right now for future generations that people inhabited Long Island before monkeys did. Otherwise, future scientists will be puzzled to know whether the primates or the humans got there first, and whether we descended from the monkeys or the monkeys from us. Let it be recorded that these escaped monkeys have no connection with the human race."
That same night, park manager Loveland decided to try a new technique. It had been suggested to him by a Montreal man who used the same exact method to capture 18 escapees from an amusement park up there. And it was a really simple idea. All you need to do is get the monkeys drunk, and of course then they can't climb. So he proceeded to lay out pans that were filled with bourbon. The next day, 3 monkeys were found. 2 were staggering and were taken back to the zoo, and they did recover. But sadly, the 3rd had passed out and died of acute alcoholism. So Loveland declared that he would never, ever use that technique again. By the time Frank Buck returned from his safari adventures on September 4th of 1935, all but 5 of the monkeys had been accounted for. There were 4 females and 1 male still missing. That male, of course, was none other than Al Capone. The reality was that there was little hope of ever capturing them. And with the press, of course, losing interest eventually, it's unknown if any additional were ever caught. Of course, add to that the fact that the zoo never really did have an exact count of how many monkeys had escaped, so there may have been more out there. But in the end, the zoo did gangbuster business from the publicity that the monkey escape had brought them. The numbers do vary, but some newspapers reported that as many as 10,000 people visited the park that summer. Today, Frank Buck's jungle camp is long gone. But if you'd like to visit the spot where Monkey Mountain once stood, just set your GPS to 5500 Sunrise Highway in Massapequa, New York. But I don't think you're going to be happy with what you find there. Instead of a zoo or a park or anything like that, you're going to find a giant paved parking lot with your typical suburban strip mall. But if you look carefully enough, right at the entrance of the lot, there is a historical marker. And it reads, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. Frank Buck Zoo. Famous Bring 'em Back Alive. 20-acre jungle camp 1934 to circa 1944. World War II small arms defense factory circa 1945. Grimaldi's Kiddie Park Petting Zoo 1951 to 1965. My hunch is that most people just drive by that sign without ever noticing its existence. Let's face it, the nearby AT&T store and the McDonald's restaurant, they're far more likely to grab one's attention. As for the monkeys, well, for all you know, they could still be out there somewhere. They'd all be descendants of one Al Capone and his 4 mistresses. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. Well, that brings another episode of the Useless Information Podcast to a close, and I hope you found that story as enjoyable as I did. Just a reminder that you can find the Useless Information Podcast on all the major podcast platforms, and of course a lot of the smaller ones also, so don't forget to hit that follow button. The Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so be sure to visit airwavemedia.com, and there you'll find an ever-expanding selection of some of the very best podcasts out there. Anyway, I'll be back shortly with the next episode, so stay tuned for that. As always, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.